That one's going to kill someone before Friday." The words came from Captain Lydia Brennan, and she said them with the flat certainty of a woman reading a weather forecast. She was standing 10 feet from Kennel Block 7, arms folded, watching through the reinforced observation window as a 90-pound Belgian Malinois named Kestrel systematically destroyed a steel water bowl by smashing it against the concrete wall, over and over, with the methodical intensity of a prisoner counting days. The sound rang through the building like a broken bell. Behind Kestrel, 4 other dogs occupied 4 other runs, and each one was its own kind of hell. Sable, a jet-black German shepherd with a chest like a barrel, paced the back wall of his kennel in a tight, obsessive figure 8, his nails clicking on the floor in a rhythm that hadn't stopped in 3 days. Ajax, a Dutch shepherd whose service jacket listed 11 deployments across 4 theaters, sat perfectly still in the center of his run, staring at the wall with an emptiness that was somehow worse than all the noise around him. Then there was Riot, a dark brindle Malinois with a torn left ear who had bitten 2 handlers in the past week, and Zephyr, the youngest at 5 years old, who howled, not barked, not whined. Howled, a long, rising, broken sound that started somewhere deep in her ribcage and came out like grief given a voice. 5 dogs, 5 catastrophes, and every one of them a decorated combat veteran. First Sergeant Tom Jepson stood beside Brennan, a clipboard in his hand that he hadn't looked at in 20 minutes. He was watching Sable pace. He'd been watching Sable pace for 3 days now, and it was starting to follow him into his sleep. "Kill someone might be generous, ma'am," he said. Riot already put Airman Chen in the ER's 12 stitches in his forearm. Kids requesting reassignment. Can't blame him. Brennan didn't respond immediately. She was 34, West Point class of 2018, with a PhD in behavioral neuroscience from Johns Hopkins that she'd earned on the Army's dime, with the understanding that she would apply it to the military working dog program. She was brilliant, driven, and thoroughly out of her depth. "The assessment from Walter Reed came back this morning," she said. "Their recommendation is pharmacological intervention. Trazodone, clonidine, possibly a sapromazine for transport." "Drugs," Jepson said. "They want to drug them. They want to sedate them enough to make them manageable. And if that doesn't work within the 60-day window, the recommendation escalates to behavioral euthanasia." She said the last 2 words carefully, like handling something fragile and poisonous. Jepson's jaw worked. He'd been in the K9 program for 22 years, had trained more dogs than he could count, had seen them born and seen them die. But these 5 were different. These 5 had come back from something that wasn't supposed to happen, and they had come back without the people who mattered most. Operation Greycliff. That's what the file said, though the file itself was mostly black lines and redaction codes. What Jepson knew, what everyone in the MWD community knew without officially knowing, was that 7 months ago a joint special operations element had been inserted into a location that no one would name, for a purpose no one would discuss. 4 handler teams went in. 0 handler teams came out intact. 2 handlers killed in action. 1 medically retired with a traumatic brain injury so severe he couldn't remember his own name. 1 transferred to a psychiatric facility at Bethesda and hadn't spoken a word since. The dogs survived. Dogs usually do. They're harder to kill than the humans who love them, and that's their curse. The 5 dogs had been recovered, flown to Ramstein, then stateside to this training facility outside of Fort Liberty, where they were supposed to be rehabilitated and eventually adopted out to law enforcement agencies or approved civilian homes. That had been the plan 7 months ago. Now the plan was drugs or death. "There's got to be something else," Jepson said, not for the first time. "There's always something else." But his voice lacked conviction, and they both knew it. He looked down at the clipboard. The behavioral logs read like a horror novel: aggression incidents, refusal to eat, self-injurious behavior. Kestrel had chewed through a bite sleeve and then started on her own paw. Sable hadn't slept more than 40 minutes at a stretch in 2 weeks. Ajax had stopped responding to his name entirely, as if the word itself had been severed from his identity. "I'm bringing in Dr. Nakata from the Veterinary Behavioral Unit at Davis," Brennan said. "She's published on canine PTSD. Maybe she can see something we're missing." Jepson didn't argue, but his expression said what his mouth wouldn't. They'd already brought in 3 specialists. Each one had left with the same baffled, slightly shaken look, like mechanics who'd opened a hood and found the engine missing entirely. The morning Brennan was expecting Dr. Nakata, she got a phone call instead. Flight delayed, rescheduled, wouldn't arrive until Thursday. Brennan hung up, rubbed her temples, and walked to the kennel building to start the daily assessment rounds herself. It was 0615 early September, and the air over Fort Liberty was thick and warm with the last stubborn breath of summer. She pushed through the double doors of Kennel Block 7 and stopped. The building was quiet. Not reduced noise quiet, not slightly calmer than yesterday quiet, silent. The kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your eardrums and makes you check if you've gone deaf. She stood in the hallway, one hand still on the door, her brain struggling to process the absence of sound that had been a constant for 7 months. No howling from Zephyr, no metallic crashing from Kestrel, no clicking nails from Sable's endless patrol. Nothing. Her hand went to her sidearm out of pure reflex, and then she heard it. A voice. Low, unhurried, barely above a murmur, coming from the far end of the kennel block. She walked toward it, her boots loud in the impossible quiet, and what she found at the end of the corridor would stay with her for the rest of her career. A man was sitting on an overturned bucket in front of Ajax's kennel. He was old, not retirement age old, but deep old, the kind of old that looks carved rather than worn. He had a lean, angular face weathered to the color of saddle leather, with deep vertical lines bracketing his mouth, and a white stubble that caught the fluorescent light like frost. He wore the olive drab coveralls of the facility's maintenance staff, the name patch on his chest reading Lundgren in faded block letters. His boots were scuffed, his hands were resting on his knees, and he was talking to the dog. Not at the dog. To the dog. The way you'd talk to someone sitting across from you at a kitchen table, sharing a pot of coffee and a long silence. Ajax, the dog who hadn't responded to a human voice in 4 months, was lying at the front of his run with his chin on his paws, his dark eyes fixed on the old man's face. His tail, an appendage that the behavioral team had formally documented as non-responsive to all stimuli, was moving. A slow, heavy wag, like a pendulum winding down to its truest rhythm. Brennan looked at the other kennels. Every dog was lying down, not cowering, not collapsed in exhaustion, lying in the relaxed, sphinx-like posture of dogs at rest. Ears forward, eyes soft, bodies loose. Kestrel's mangled water bowl sat untouched in the corner. Sable was motionless for the first time in weeks, his massive head resting on his forepaws, his eyes half closed. Even Riot, the biter, was calm, stretched on his side like a dog sunning itself in a backyard. And Zephyr was asleep, actually, genuinely, peacefully asleep, her ribcage rising and falling in the slow cadence of deep rest. "Who are you?" Brennan said, and her voice came out sharper than she intended, a reaction to the shock of what she was seeing. "How did you get in here?" "This block requires level 3 clearance." The old man didn't startle. He turned his head slowly, the way someone might look up from a book they weren't quite ready to put down. His eyes were a washed gray blue, pale as river ice, and they held a calm so deep it felt geological. "Lundgren," he said, tapping the name patch on his chest. "Been fixing the drainage line in the utility trench out back." Access was open. His voice was quiet, with a faint Midwestern flatness to it, the accent of a man from nowhere in particular. "I came through to check the standpipe connection in here and heard her." He nodded toward Zephyr's kennel. "That sound she was making. That's not aggression, Captain. That's a funeral song. She's mourning." Brennan stared at him. "Your maintenance. That's what it says on the patch. Maintenance staff are not authorized to interact with the MWDs. These are level 3 restricted animals." "I'm not interacting with them," Lundgren said mildly. "I'm sitting on a bucket." Before Brennan could respond, Jepson came through the doors behind her, moving fast. He'd seen the surveillance feed from his office and had come running. He stopped short when he registered the silence, his eyes sweeping the kennels, then locking onto the old man. "What in the hell?" Jepson breathed. Brennan held up a hand. "Maintenance worker. Says he came in through the utility access." Jepson wasn't listening to her. He was staring at the dogs. 22 years in the program, and he had never seen anything like this. 5 shattered, dangerous animals, each one a loaded weapon of teeth and trauma, lying in perfect composure around a stranger in Janitor's coveralls. His gaze shifted to the old man, and his eyes narrowed. Something about the way Lundgren was sitting didn't add up. The posture was too intentional, too balanced. His hands on his knees weren't resting. They were placed, slightly spread, palms down. It was the handler's neutral position, the stance you learned in the first week of MWD school and spent years perfecting. The way you held your body when you wanted a dog to read you as safe without reading you as submissive. Jepson had taught that posture to 100 handlers. This man hadn't learned it from a PowerPoint slide. "Mr. Lundgren," Jepsen said carefully, "how long have you been sitting here?" "About 40 minutes. And they've been like this the whole time?" "Not the whole time. When I came in, the little one was howling. I sat down and she stopped. Then the others settled in." "They're tired, First Sergeant. They've been running on adrenaline and cortisol for months. They just needed permission to stop." The clinical precision of that last sentence hung in the air. Adrenaline and cortisol. Permission to stop. This wasn't how a pipefitter talked about dogs. Brennan and Jepsen exchanged a look. "You've worked with dogs before," Brennan said. It wasn't a question. Lundgren's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, a door opening a crack and then pulling back. "I've been around them," he said. "A long time ago." He stood up from the bucket with a deliberate slowness, and Brennan noticed two things simultaneously. First, for a man who looked to be in his mid-70s, he moved with a controlled economy that spoke of a body that had been trained to move precisely and never quite forgot. Second, his hands. They were mapped with scars. Not the random nicks and cuts of a tradesman, but a specific pattern. White lines across the palms and the webbing between thumb and forefinger, the ghost imprint of leather and cord pulled tight under extreme force, over and over, for years. She'd seen those marks before, in photographs from the handler training archives. They were the marks of a man who had spent a lifetime on the working end of a leash in situations where letting go meant someone died. "I should get back to the standpipe," Lundgren said, picking up a small canvas tool bag from the floor. "You want me to go back through the utility trench? I'll secure the access behind me." "Wait," Jepsen said. The word came out before he could think about it, propelled by something deeper than protocol. "Just wait." He walked past Brennan, past the old man, and stopped in front of Ajax's kennel. The German shepherd, who hadn't acknowledged a human being in 4 months, looked up at Jepsen and held his gaze. The dog's eyes were clear, present, aware. Whatever wall Ajax had built between himself and the world, the old man had found a door through it. Jepsen crouched down, his knees popping, and extended his hand to the fence. Ajax leaned forward and pressed his nose to Jepsen's fingers through the chain link. The contact was warm, wet, and it felt like something coming back from the dead. Jepsen's throat tightened. "Captain," he said without turning around, his voice rough, "we need to talk to this man." Brennan nodded. She was already pulling her phone from her pocket, canceling the call to Dr. Nakata. They sat in the kennel office, a cramped room that smelled like kibble and disinfectant. Brennan behind the desk, Jepsen leaning against the filing cabinet, and Lundgren in the plastic chair usually reserved for handlers getting their quarterly evaluations. He looked entirely at ease, which in Brennan's experience was unusual for anyone summoned to explain themselves by a captain and a first sergeant. "I pulled your personnel file from the facilities management office," Brennan said, placing a thin folder on the desk. "Jonas Lundgren. Hired 8 months ago through a civilian contractor. Prior employment listed as agricultural maintenance in Ely, Minnesota. No military service indicated." Lundgren looked at the folder but didn't reach for it. "That's correct, Mr. Lundgren. What I saw in that kennel block is not something a farmhand from Minnesota can do. With respect, Captain, you'd be surprised what a farmhand from Minnesota can do." A trace of something passed across his face. Not quite a smile, more like the memory of one. Jepsen cut in. "I've been doing this for 22 years. I've seen the best handlers in the world work their dogs. I once watched a Navy SEAL K9 handler in Kandahar work his Malinois through a building clearance so smooth it looked choreographed. What you did in there makes that look like a parlor trick." Lundgren said nothing. "Those dogs don't know you," Jepsen continued, leaning forward. "They've never seen you, never scented you, never trained with you. You walked in, sat down, and 5 of the most traumatized combat dogs I've ever seen decided you were safe. That doesn't happen. It can't happen. And yet," Lundgren said quietly. The room was still. Somewhere down the hall a dog sighed in its sleep. Brennan studied the old man's face, looking for the tell, the crack that would let her see what was underneath. She found it in his eyes. They weren't evasive or calculating. They were tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a very long time, not in the arms but in the chest. "I'm going to ask you a direct question," Brennan said, "and I'd appreciate a direct answer. Were you a military dog handler?" Lundgren held her gaze for a long moment. "No," he said finally. "I was never a dog handler." Jepsen made a sound of frustration, but Lundgren continued. "I was something else. The dogs were part of it, but we weren't handlers. We didn't have a name for what we were. The program didn't have a name either, or if it did, I never knew it. I was recruited out of basic training in 1974. They said I had an aptitude. I thought they meant mechanical aptitude. Turned out they meant something different. He paused, his scarred hands resting flat on his thighs. We worked in pairs, one man, one dog, but not the way the MWD program works. We didn't train the dogs, we became the dogs. We ate with them, slept with them, ran with them. We learned to think the way they thought, to read scent patterns, to feel changes in air pressure that meant someone was behind the next door. After 2 years, you stopped being two separate organisms. You became one thing. Brennan's analytical mind was firing on every cylinder. Operant conditioning at that level of integration would require. It wasn't conditioning, Lundgren said, not unkindly. Conditioning is what you do to a machine. This was a relationship. It was trust built on 10,000 shared moments where one of you could have let the other one die, and neither of you ever did. Where did you operate? Jepson asked, his voice low. Places that aren't on your maps, First Sergeant. Behind curtains that don't exist anymore. Some of them in jungles, some of them in cities that have different names now. It was a long time ago, and none of it's in a file anywhere. When the program ended, they thanked us, gave us new names, and told us to find a quiet life. So I went to Minnesota and fixed things. Tractors, mostly. Some plumbing. It's honest work. He looked toward the door, toward the hallway that led to the kennels. I didn't plan on coming in here. I heard that dog crying and I couldn't walk past it. There are sounds you learn to recognize. That sound she was making isn't rage. It's the sound a dog makes when it's lost the one person who made the world make sense. I've heard it before. I've made it before. The last sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody spoke for a full 10 seconds. Mr. Lundgren, Brennan said, and for the first time her voice had lost its command edge and become simply the voice of a woman asking for help. I have 60 days before they put those dogs down. I have 3 specialists who can't figure out what's wrong, a team of handlers who are afraid to go near them, and a stack of protocols that aren't working. I need you to tell me what you would do. Lundgren looked at her, and something in his pale eyes shifted, the door opening wider now, letting light through. I wouldn't do anything to them, he said. I'd do something with them. There's a difference. He leaned forward, his forearms on his knees, his voice dropping into the low, steady register of a man who'd thought about this for a long time. Those dogs aren't broken, Captain. They're uninsured. They had a purpose and a partner, and both were ripped away at the same time. Everything they are, everything they were trained to be, is still in there. It's just spinning in the dark with nothing to lock onto. They don't need medication. They don't need desensitization therapy. They need someone to walk through the door and be the person who stays. Brennan gave him the keys to Kennel Block 7 that afternoon. It was the most unorthodox decision of her career, one that she would later have to defend in a 17-page memorandum to the provost marshal. But standing in that office, looking at the man's scarred hands and quiet eyes, she knew it was the only decision that made sense. She told Jepson to give Lundgren whatever he needed and to stay close, not to intervene, to watch, to learn. Lundgren started with Ajax. He didn't rush. He brought a wooden folding chair into the kennel block and set it in front of Ajax's run, then sat down and did nothing. He just breathed. Slow, even breaths, his body relaxed, his eyes soft. He sat there for 90 minutes without saying a word, without moving, without checking his phone or shifting his weight. He just existed in the same space as the dog and let the silence speak. Ajax watched him the whole time. By the end of the first hour, the dog's head was resting on his paws. By the end of the 90 minutes, Ajax's eyes were closed, and the faintest whimper, almost inaudible, escaped his throat. It was the sound of something thawing. When Lundgren finally opened the kennel door, he didn't use a command. He simply stood to the side, his body forming an open invitation rather than a barrier, and clicked his tongue once. Ajax stood, stretched, and walked out. He didn't bolt, didn't lunge, didn't test. He walked to Lundgren's left side and sat, pressing his shoulder against the old man's leg, and stayed there. Jepson, watching from the observation window with 2 young handlers who had been too frightened to enter the block for weeks, felt something burn behind his eyes that he would later deny was tears. One by one, over the next 4 hours, Lundgren opened every kennel. Each dog received a different approach, calibrated to its specific wound. With Kestrel, the destroyer, he was physical. He knelt and let her mouth his forearm, not a bite but a grip, the same way she would have held a bite sleeve in training. He let her feel her own strength against something that wasn't afraid of it, something that absorbed it without flinching. When she finally released and licked the spot where her teeth had been, he scratched behind her ears and murmured something in a language Jepsen couldn't identify. With Sable, the pacer, Lundgren simply walked. He opened the kennel, attached a leather lead he'd pulled from his canvas bag, and walked Sable up and down the corridor, then outside, then around the perimeter of the building. No commands, no corrections. Just two creatures moving together, matching stride. Sable's obsessive figure eight dissolved into a forward motion, purpose replacing pattern, and his clicking nails finally found a rhythm that made sense. Riot, the biter, got the longest session. Lundgren sat outside his kennel for 45 minutes before even attempting to open the gate. When he finally did, Riot came out bristling, his torn ear flattened, his lip curled. Lundgren didn't back up. He didn't tense. He dropped to one knee and turned his body slightly sideways, presenting his profile rather than his front, making himself simultaneously smaller and less threatening. Then he did something extraordinary. He yawned. A slow, deliberate, jaw-cracking yawn, the universal canine signal for "I am not a threat." Riot stared at him, the aggression flickering like a flame losing its fuel. The dog yawned back. It was involuntary, a neurological mirror response, but it broke something. The curl left his lip. The ear came up. He took one step forward, then another, and pressed his nose against Lundgren's outstretched palm. The old man's fingers closed gently around the dog's muzzle, holding it there, and for a moment neither of them moved. Zephyr was last. The howler, the mourner, the one whose grief had a voice. Lundgren opened her gate and she came out immediately, as if she'd been waiting. She didn't go to his side. She went to his chest. She reared up on her hind legs, placed her front paws on his shoulders, and buried her face in the crook of his neck. She weighed close to 70 pounds, and the force of it nearly knocked him backward, but he absorbed it, wrapping his arms around her, holding her the way you hold someone who is shaking apart. She didn't howl. She whimpered, and then she was quiet, and her body went still against his, and she stayed there for a long time. When all 5 dogs were out, they formed a loose constellation around Lundgren in the exercise yard, not a rigid formation but a natural clustering, the geometry of trust. Brennan watched from the fence, her notebook open but her pen still. There was nothing in her PhD curriculum that had prepared her for this. She was watching a man speak a language that had no textbook, no syllabus, no peer-reviewed journal. It was a language written in posture and breath and the precise weight of a hand on a dog's skull. It was ancient and it was specific, and she wanted desperately to learn it. "First Sergeant," Lundgren called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "Bring your people." Jepsen looked at Brennan. She nodded. He waved to the 2 young handlers, Specialist Rivera and Airman First Class Tanaka, who had been watching from the doorway, with expressions caught between awe and terror. "Get in here," Jepsen said, "and leave your fear at the gate. He'll know if you bring it in, and so will they." They entered the yard like soldiers entering a minefield, which in their recent experience it essentially was. Lundgren didn't coddle them. He placed a leash in Rivera's hand and folded her fingers around the leather, adjusting her grip with a gentle precision. "You're holding a conversation," he told her, "not a chain. Sable needs to feel your heartbeat through this leather. If it's racing, he'll race. If it's steady, he'll steady. You set the tempo." Rivera swallowed, nodded, and began to walk. Sable fell in beside her, his massive head at her hip, his stride matching hers. After 10 yards, her shoulders dropped. After 20, something in her face changed, a tightness releasing, a realization arriving. She was doing it. The dog wasn't tolerating her. The dog was with her. Tanaka got Kestrel and the instructions were different. She's a point dog. She wants to be out front. Let her have 3 feet of lead and follow her nose. Your job isn't to direct her. Your job is to trust her. She's been making life and death decisions in places you've never been. Respect that. Tanaka let out the lead, and Kestrel surged forward, not aggressively but eagerly, her head sweeping side to side, reading the air. Tanaka followed, and for the first time in months, Kestrel was doing what she was born to do. She was working. Jepsen took Riot, and Lundgren watched the old first sergeant with an approving nod. Jepsen's hands were steady, his posture calm, his decades of experience asserting themselves now that the impossible barrier of the dog's trauma had been breached. Riot walked at his side with a wary but willing energy, the biter becoming a partner. Brennan hung back, watching the 4 handlers and 4 dogs move through the yard in an intricate, unscripted dance. It looked effortless. It was anything but. It was the culmination of a knowledge so deep that it defied documentation, passed from one man to 4 others through touch and tone, and the precise placement of a hand. After an hour, the dogs were returned to their kennels. They went in without resistance, lying down with the heavy contentment of animals who had done something meaningful. Lundgren latched the last gate and turned to face the small group, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist. "Same time tomorrow," he said. "Every day, no exceptions, no substitutions. Same people, same dogs. They need consistency more than they need technique. They need to know that the person who walks through that door today will be the same person who walks through it tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. That's what they lost. That's what you're giving back." He picked up his canvas bag. "I should go finish that standpipe." "Mr. Lundgren," Brennan said. "Jonas," he stopped. "There is no standpipe issue in Kennel Block 7. I checked the work orders. There hasn't been a maintenance request for this building in 3 months. Lundgren was quiet for a moment. Then the faintest ghost of a smile crossed his face, there and gone like a cloud shadow on a field. "Must have been a different building," he said. "My mistake." He walked away, his coveralls hanging loose on his lean frame, his gait unhurried. He didn't look back. They followed his instructions. Every morning at 0600, Brennan, Jepsen, Rivera, and Tanaka entered Kennel Block 7 and spent 2 hours with the dogs. Grooming, walking, running scent detection exercises in the yard with decommissioned training aids that Jepsen scrounged from the supply depot. They spoke to the dogs in low, steady voices. They learned to read the subtle signals, the ear position that meant unease, the weight shift that meant anticipation, the barely perceptible tail change that meant trust was being extended, fragile as a filament, strong as braided steel. Lundgren came every day for the first week. He said less and less as the days went on, because there was less to say. The handlers were learning the language now, their own fluency growing with each session. He'd stand at the fence watching, and occasionally he'd call out a small correction. "Rivera, your breathing is shallow. Take a breath from your stomach, not your chest. Sable can feel the difference." Or, "Tanaka, stop looking at Kestrel's teeth. Look at her eyes. That's where she's talking to you." On the 7th day, he arrived with his canvas bag and a thermos of coffee. He sat on the fence rail and watched the entire session without saying a word. When it was over, he walked to Jepsen and extended his hand. "You don't need me anymore," he said. "You've got it." Jepsen shook his hand and held it. "Jonas, tell me something, Graycliff. Those dogs were part of something bad, something classified. You knew, didn't you? Before you ever walked into that kennel." Lundgren gently withdrew his hand. "I knew what a grieving dog looks like, First Sergeant. I've been one." He turned to go, then paused, looking back over his shoulder at the kennel building, at the 5 runs where 5 dogs now lay in peaceful, orderly calm, their eyes tracking the familiar figures of their new people. "Take care of them," he said. "They've earned it." And then Jonas Lundgren, maintenance worker, standpipe specialist, and ghost of a program that never existed, walked across the parking lot toward an old blue pickup truck that none of them had ever noticed before and drove away. 3 days later, a package arrived at the kennel office. It was a battered shoebox wrapped in brown paper, postmarked from a town in northern Minnesota that Brennan had to look up on a map. There was no return address, no letter. Inside, wrapped in a piece of soft flannel, were 5 leather collar bands. They were old, supple with decades of oil and handling, the brass buckles tarnished to a deep patina. Each one had a name stamped into the leather in small, neat block letters, not the names of dogs that Brennan recognized. Rook, Signal, Flint, Meissen, Vera, names from a different time, different dogs, different wars. Beneath the collars was a single item, a black and white photograph, its edges soft with age. A young man, barely 20, lean and hard-jawed in a uniform stripped of all insignia, kneeling beside a German shepherd in what looked like dense jungle. The man's hand rested on the dog's head, and both of them were looking at the camera with an expression that was identical, a shared alertness, a shared calm, a bond so total it made them look like 2 halves of the same creature. On the back of the photograph, in a hand that was steady but bore the faintest tremor of age, someone had written 5 words. "They hear what you feel." Brennan framed the photograph and hung it in the kennel office. The 5 leather collars she distributed to her team, one for each handler to keep. Rivera wore hers on her wrist. Tanaka hung his from his rearview mirror, and Jepsen put his in his breast pocket where he could feel it against his chest. Weeks became months. The dogs transformed, not into the weapons they had been, but into something gentler and perhaps more powerful. Ajax became the first of the 5 to be adopted, going home with a retired Special Forces warrant officer in Fayetteville, who had lost his own MWD to cancer the year before. The man sat in Ajax's kennel for an hour before taking him home, just sitting, just breathing, and when he finally clipped the leash and walked the dog to his truck, Ajax jumped into the passenger seat and laid his head on the man's thigh and closed his eyes. Sable went to a search and rescue team in Virginia, where his endless energy finally found a purpose that matched its depth. Kestrel was placed with a police department in Oregon, where her drive and precision made her the best narcotics detection dog in the state within 6 months. Riot, the biter, the one everyone had been most afraid of, went to a children's hospital therapy program and never showed his teeth in anger again. Something about the smallness and vulnerability of the children unlocked a gentleness in him that his combat career had buried, but never destroyed. Zephyr, the howler, stayed. Brennan couldn't let her go. She filed the paperwork, paid the adoption fee, and took the dog home to her apartment off post, where Zephyr slept at the foot of her bed and never howled again. Some nights, though, Brennan would wake to find the dog sitting at the window, staring out at the darkness, ears forward, as if listening for a voice that only she could hear. And on those nights, Brennan would sit beside her and rest a hand on her back and listen too. And in the silence between them, she could almost hear it, faint and far away, the quiet assurance of a man who had walked through the door when no one else would, and who had known, without being told, exactly what the silence needed. A year after Jonas Lundgren disappeared, a colonel from the Pentagon's Special Programs Office visited the kennel facility on an unrelated inspection. He was walking through the building with Brennan when he stopped in front of the framed photograph on the office wall. He stared at it for a long time, his face unreadable. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Brennan told him the story. The maintenance worker, the 5 dogs, the silence, the collars, the photograph. The colonel listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving the young man and the dog in the jungle. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That program," he said carefully, "if it existed, would have been one of the most classified joint ventures of the Cold War. The men who served in it, if they existed, were told they would never be acknowledged. No records, no medals, no pension. They gave everything and were promised nothing in return." He looked at Brennan. "If I were to tell you that I've heard of Jonas Lundgren, which I'm not saying I have, I would tell you that the man in this photograph saved more lives than most generals, and that the only beings on this planet who know the full truth of what he did are buried in unmarked graves in countries that don't exist anymore." He straightened his tie. "That's a nice photograph," he said. "You should keep it where it is." And he walked out. That evening, Brennan took Zephyr for their usual walk around the perimeter of the base. The autumn sky was deep and clear, the stars just beginning to show. Zephyr moved beside her, with the easy, confident stride of a dog who had found her footing in the world again, who had learned that the person at the other end of the leash would be there tomorrow. Brennan thought about Jonas Lundgren. She thought about the old leather collars stamped with the names of dogs long dead, carried through jungles and across border by a man the world had agreed to forget. She thought about what he had said, that a dog without a purpose is a ghost. She understood now that the same was true of people. She looked down at her hands, calloused now from months of leash work and grooming, lined with the first faint scars of the handler's trade. She had started this assignment as a scientist, armed with data and protocols and the unshakable belief that every problem was a system to be optimized. Jonas Lundgren had not argued with that belief. He hadn't needed to. He had simply walked into a room full of broken, furious, grieving animals and shown her that some systems can only be understood from the inside, by becoming part of them, by listening not with instruments, but with hands, by leading not with authority, but with presence. The leash was loose in her palm, Zephyr's warmth steady against her leg, and the night was quiet, and it was enough. They hear what you feel. She finally understood what that meant.